All right, you're here with Dominic Ferlito, and
Brandon Meraldo.
we're going to talk a little bit about Cleveland State basketball, preview the season a little bit, talk about some new hirings, and the loss of a legend. So, Brandon, you're a bit of a scholar when it comes to Cleveland State basketball, so let's talk about the new coach, Dennis Felton. Tell me a little bit about him, Brandon.
This is Coach Felton's third go-around as a head coach. He had previous stops in Western Kentucky and Georgia. He also worked for the Spurs as a pro player personnel from 2010 until 2013 before he got back into coaching at Tulsa, where he was the assistant from 2014 through 2017 before accepting the head role here at Cleveland State.
He's replacing Gary Waters after 11 seasons. Waters retired this past offseason after kind of a tumultuous final 2 years. Last year, the Vikings went kind of a not very good 9-2, but they look to improve this offseason. Felton's going to be the 15th coach in program history, and he actually brings in an entirely new coaching staff with him, hoping to get back into March Madness for the first time since 2009. So, there's some big games coming up this season, Brandon. Obviously, I think the headliner probably for everybody is going to be Michigan State. They're ranked
Number two.
Number 2 right now in the preseason polls. So that's a pretty exciting game for CSU, and it also happens to come at a pretty good time. The game is December 29th, so it's right in that holiday sweet spot between Christmas, Hanukkah, and New Year's Eve. So there's no excuse to not watch the game. It's going to be on Big Ten Network, and for Michigan State, it probably isn't going to be the biggest of games. For Cleveland State, it could really be a statement game, right?
It could really help the recruiting process. Try to get more bigger name recruits in here to help the team out.
And
Michigan State has a couple good players as well. They have Miles Bridges, who's the preseason Big Ten Player of the Year, as well as the preseason Freshman Player of the Year, and Jaren Jackson. So the two big names to watch out for in that matchup.
And you mentioned that it could be big for recruiting. Cleveland State's actually got a pretty big interest in recruiting up in Detroit and that area. We've recruited several players from there. They actually just signed Rashad Williams, who is one of the top guards in Michigan. He signed his national letter of intent in the second week of November. Tell me a little about Rashad Williams, Brandon.
He's a 6'3" point guard who averaged 24 points, 4 rebounds, and 7 assists at Wayne Memorial High School last season. He's an elite sharpshooter, knocking down 78 threes last season to lead his team to a 19-4 record.
And then the Vikings also have a hard commitment from a Serbian basketball player named Uros Plavsic. He's coming out of Tennessee. He's playing his senior season there. He's a EuroLeague teammate of current Viking forward Stefan Kennick, and they're kind of crediting Drazen Zloverik, who's one of the new assistant coaches. He helped bring in Kennick, and now it seems like he's also helping to bring in Uros Plavsic, who is going to be seems like he could be a pretty good big man for Coach Felton as time goes on. The Vikings played their first and only public preseason game against Cedarville on November 2nd. They ended up winning that game 78-60, but the score wasn't really as much of a big deal as it was just seeing what the players could do against opponents, right, Brandon?
Yeah, so last season they were pretty bad again in the assist category, only averaging about 10 a game. This season they've started off pretty well, averaging with the 17 assists in the first game, shooting 47% from the field, which is a pretty good sign for this team, including leading scorer Kenny Carpenter, who had 16 on 5 of 12 shooting.
Kenny's a senior. He's he should be one of the leaders on the team. He led the team in minutes in that exhibition against Cedarville. Who else seems like they're going to kind of take the lead in this season, Brandon?
Well, their top returning scorer from last season is Bobby Word. He's a 6'4" guard. He's a senior. He ranked 7th last year in threes per game at 2.1. And in their first game, he had 14 points and making 2 of his 5 threes, good for 40%, which if he can shoot that this season, that could be really big for this team.
And CSU in the past has kind of lived by the three and died by the three. And it was a little bit more dying than it was living the past couple seasons. Another player that should be a pretty big contributor to the Vikings this year is Kashim Thomas. Started every game as a freshman last year, which is a pretty big deal. It's not often that freshmen are able to come into the NCAA and automatically make an impact, but Cash seems to have been able to do that. Tell me a little bit more about him, Brandon.
Back to your point about him starting all the games, it's actually the most by a freshman in Cleveland State history, which is quite impressive. He was the point guard. He averaged 7.7 points per game last year and 3.3 assists, which was 9th in the Horizon League. He ranked 3rd in the Horizon League in assist-to-turnover ratio at 2.1 with 102 assists to just 49 turnovers. He had 7 games last season in which he had at least 6 assists. He played a career-high 40 minutes last season against Wright State. So Thomas could be a very important part to this team. If he can continue to build upon what he did last season, it can really help Cleveland State make another step in becoming a better team in the future.
And then kind of following in the footsteps of Thomas, we got Tyree Appleby. He's going to be he's a freshman this year. He came off the bench against Cedarville in that exhibition game, but he got 25 minutes, which kind of tells me that he's probably going to be a pretty big contributor to this team. It's still hard to tell because it's so early and because Coach Felton's so new. It's kind of hard to tell exactly where this team's going to go and how Coach Felton's going to distribute minutes. But it's going to be fun to see just because there is some good youth on this team, but there is also a good amount of veteran leadership in the upperclassmen. You got Jamarcus Hairston and Dontel Highsmith, who both have some experience that could help them against those tough league games when we get into the grind of the Horizon League season. And there's a real tough week in the 3rd week of December where that veteran leadership's really, really going to play a big role. Going back to kind of the season in the Horizon League, we got Youngstown State on New Year's Day. So it's going to be at the Wolstein Center. That's a Horizon League game. It's a New Year's Day game. Holiday games are always kind of a big deal. Wright State is always a tough opponent for CSU. And we've got a couple of games against Oakland that are always kind of fun to watch. Oakland's always bring some sort of talent. If you'll remember Kay Felder, who was on the Cavs last season, he was a standout star at Oakland and kind of on a smaller scale, but almost had a Steph Curry-like season his last season at Oakland, where he wasn't physically dominant, but just a really exciting player to watch. Some other big games, probably the biggest outside of Michigan State is Cincinnati. What do you have to say about those pesky Bearcats down in Cincinnati?
Cincinnati last year, they were a very stingy defensive team, only holding their opponents to 61.3 points per game last season, which was 8th in all of college basketball. So, pretty good defensive team. They're also returning their top 3 scorers from last year. Jacob Evans, who averaged 13.5 points a game. Kyle Washington, a senior forward who averaged 13 points per game. And Gary Clark, another senior forward who averaged 11 points per game. So, when you play Cincinnati and Michigan State in an 8-day span, it's going to be a tough week for the Vikings of Cleveland State. Hopefully they might be able to maybe squeak out, maybe get a win. They also played Toledo in the middle.
Yeah, and Toledo's not going to be an easy opponent to beat either. Luckily, that game is at home, but still, it's a pretty strong week for Cleveland State basketball. If they walk out with a win, I'd say it's a success, regardless of the scores. Heading into February, there's actually all their opponents in February are league opponents, headlined by Oakland, Youngstown State, and Wright State, headed right into the Horizon League Championship, which is being held up in Detroit at the Joe Louis Arena. That takes place March 2nd through the 6th. It's probably going to be your regulars. Oakland, Wright State, Northern Kentucky are always going to play pretty well in those tournaments. CSU is not knocked out, though, and certainly if Coach Felton has the type of season he expects, CSU could walk away with a March Madness berth, right?
Yeah, that's obviously got to be the goal for this season. Coming off a season last year in which they only won 9 games, you got to believe that the team's main focus this year is trying to get back to the dance, try to make a push, get there, maybe win a game. It'd be huge for the team, huge for the momentum, huge for the start of Felton's career here at Cleveland State.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 9 years since CSU's been in March Madness. March Madness is more fun when you got skin in the game, when you have someone to root for. I think everybody would root for CSU. They're always fun when they make the tournament, going back all the way to those 80s teams that were playing in the Elite Eight.
Taking on the Admiral David Robinson.
Yeah, the Admiral, an NBA legend to this day. One other thing we'd be remiss if we don't talk about Coach Mass. He's a former head coach at CSU. He's kind of a legend in college basketball. He's been around forever. He was inducted in the National Collegiate Basketball Hall of Fame in 2013. He passed away over the summer, right as school was starting out. And the loss of Massimino affects CSU pretty hard, but not only CSU, kind of the entirety of college basketball, right?
Yeah, he was a coach for Cleveland State, Villanova. He coached at UNLV for about a season or 2 seasons. He also coached Division III, Northwood. He had over 800 career wins,
which is a huge deal.
Big time wins. He also won the 1985 Division I championship with Villanova. He also had a 21-10 Division I record in March Madness, which is quite impressive.
So it would be wrong to do a podcast about Cleveland State basketball and not at least bring up Coach Mass. All right, Brandon, as we close out this podcast, tell me what you think CSU basketball, those Vikings, are going to be able to do this season.
I think the Vikings are probably going to end up more in the top half of the conference, led by Kenny Carpenter and Bobby Word. I also think freshman Tyree Appleby is going to have a pretty big season. He showed what he can do in his first exhibition game, scoring 15 points and having 5 assists. So I think if he can continue that off the bench and with Bobby and Kenny starting, I think it's a good recipe for a good, successful season.
I think if the Vikings can get to 500, that'll be a pretty big deal for the basketball program. It shows that it's going in the right direction. I don't think they're winning a championship anytime soon, but I'd like to see them at least get to the NIT. If we're lucky, get a treat and go to the big dance and see what we can do there a little bit. But
I definitely think this team, with a lot of senior leadership, should be able to make some real headway in the horizon.
Yeah, they should definitely make some strides. I think Felton's the right guy to lead the program in a bit of a different direction and lead it forward. Nothing against Coach Waters. I think he's one of the reasons that we were able to get a great head coach like Dennis Felton.
Sometimes you just need a new voice in the room.
Right, exactly. And it seems like Felton and Waters are friends, and Waters seems to still be around the program and in the city and having an impact on Cleveland basketball. So, you can't ask for much more. So, good luck to the Vikings going into the regular season.